Oregon is home to several kinds of native freshwater mussels. These animals are incredibly important for clean water and healthy watersheds. Even though mussels are easily overlooked and can resemble little more than a rock, they have a strange life cycle that relies on fish. They can also live to be older than many people, more than 100 years for one species. This presentation will introduce you to the incredible mollusks that inhabit Oregon's waters. Emilie Blevins, our speaker for this evening, is a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, where she has worked on a wide variety of spineless creatures, from stoneflies to snails to freshwater mussels. Emilie's recent work on freshwater mussels has kept her both and her snorkel mask in and out of the rivers and lakes all across Oregon and the western United States. And with that, we welcome Emilie.
Thank you. So I actually brought a box o' mussel shells for you all to have a look at, so we can hand them around if anybody would like to hold a mussel shell. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring any live animals with me, but hopefully this will give you a little bit of a sampling as to all the different species that we have. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce mussels briefly by taking a step back, because mussels are a type of mollusk, which is a really diverse group of animals that does range from the octopus to the freshwater snail to your local banana slug. It includes giant creatures like the giant clam, that's at the bottom left, that can weigh up to almost 500 pounds, and then all the way down to our local small clams known as spheroid clams. That's one on my fingertip right there. So huge diversity. Mollusks include bivalves, which are the type that we eat, like oysters and marine mussels that live in intertidal areas, all the way up to creatures that you probably wouldn't want to eat, like a banana slug crawling around. Yeah.
Just tilt the mic a little closer.
Okay. What's that? Oh, okay. So freshwater mussels are bivalves. So they are a type of mollusk that has two valves to their shell that's connected by a hinge ligament. There's a huge diversity of freshwater mussels in North America especially. So of the approximately 925 or so species of freshwater mussels found globally, we have almost a third of those just in North America. And in the fuzzy map that you can see there on the right, you can see that where red and orange and yellow occur are where we have the highest diversity, including in a single river basin, we can have as many as 100 species of freshwater mussels in that one river system. And then even among those 100 or so, you can have as many as 30 that are found nowhere else on Earth. So huge diversity. Most of it's concentrated in the southeastern U.S. You can see that we have a little bit lower diversity in the western U.S., but we do have some unique species of mussels, including one species, the western ridge mussel, that's the only member of its genus. There isn't another living creature in the same genus as that particular species. And then we also have species that are incredibly long-lived, like the western pearl shell, which can live to over 100 years. Freshwater mussels have been named over the last 150 years or so, and I would say that malacologists really have a good sense of humor for naming animals. So if you think birders like to name some crazy animals like golden-cheeked warbler or a spoonbill, we have things like the spectacle case and the rock pocketbook and the creek heel splitter. One of my favorites is the darter snapper. So we have this really cool kind of fun group of animals that I think most people aren't even aware exist. And we have this incredible diversity as well. All right. So this is what a freshwater mussel looks like if you could see through it. This is actually one of our native species. So inside the shell that characterizes the animal, it has a beating heart, you can see in that top left. You can actually see the foot in the bottom right moving around inside the shell, and then kind of within it's all sort of visceral mass that makes up the animal. So from the outside, all you might see is the shell. But inside there is actually a creature that will open up and kind of explore its environment. Freshwater mussels that are native to the U.S. differ from the non-native species like zebra mussels that you might have heard of because they are adapted to a burrowing lifestyle. So they actually will use that muscular foot to burrow down into the bottoms of our rivers and lakes and permanent water bodies, as compared to zebra mussel that's actually going to affix itself to rock or, unfortunately, infrastructure like a dam or your boat. Mussels also have this incredible life history strategy that they've developed where they're actually parasites of fish during their larval stage. This is unique among a lot of the other mollusks, which will just release their larvae into the water column or release eggs and sperm that fertilize in the water column and then drift. Mussels will actually, they internally fertilize, and then the eggs will develop into a larval stage that relies on a fish to actually encounter that larva. And I'll show you a really cool example of this. But when they do that, the larva will attach to the fish where they just hang on for 1 week, maybe 3 weeks, depending on water temperature. And unlike a tick, which might bite you and then, suck blood for a while, the glochidium, which is the larval stage of the mussel, will actually just kind of take one bite, and then it gets encapsulated, and it's along for the ride. And this is a really great adaptation for freshwater mussels because, as you can imagine, having a very slow-moving foot and spending most of your life in the bottom of a stream, it might be kind of hard to move, especially to move upstream. It's very easy to get swept downstream by high flows, for example, but for mussels to disperse up river systems or from lake to lake, they have to hitch a ride on a fish. So it's a great benefit for them and at very little cost to the fish. Fish typically don't have a very bad reaction to mussels doing this. Mussels do live for decades as an adult, so I'll show you this next, but of our native species, western pearl shell can live over 100 years. Even our least long-lived species, the floater mussels, will live for 10 to 20 years. And if you think about other aquatic macroinvertebrates in our rivers and streams, they only live, a year or a year or two, maybe a little longer, but mussels are definitely the long-lived invertebrates out there. So in the western U.S., we have 3 kinds of freshwater mussels, and I know kinds doesn't sound very scientific, but that's in part because distinguishing species among mussels has been very challenging. In fact, we used to have many, many more species of mussels than we do now because we often named the same species multiple times based on what they look like by the shell. And if you've ever picked up a mussel shell, they are not very exciting looking. They are rather plain. They don't have a lot of distinguishing features, and so it turned out that was not a great way to distinguish among species. So we still have that issue with our floater mussels, which are the ones in the bottom right there. They're what we call taxonomically confusing, and so we know that we have on the order of 4 to 5 different species of mussels that are considered floaters. And then we do know that we have 2 other kinds, the western pearl shell and western ridge mussel. The map that I'm showing at the right, that's an accumulation of all the records for freshwater mussels. Anyone who's ever collected a shell and contributed it to a museum or reported observations to us, there's a dot on the map. So that's for all the different species. But what you can see is that most of our western mussels really only occur west of the Rocky Mountains, and it's highly concentrated in places like Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. So our western pearl shell is a host fish specialist on salmon. So when we find populations of western pearl shell, we know that those are places where their host fish, salmon or trout, have actually encountered those glochidia and carried them to a new site. So it's a good sign when you see western pearl shell because it means you're also in salmon and trout habitat. They can only use those species to reproduce. I put a little drawing up there of the part of a mussel shell that's called the mantle, and that's actually the part that secretes the shell for the animal, but it also has ornamentation along the edges of the incurrent siphon, which I'll show you a mussel filtering in just a minute. But the papillae there are distinctive among our western species. So if you happen to be snorkeling in a river and you come across a mussel bed, if it's open and filtering, you could tell what species you were looking at just by looking at those. The western ridge mussel is named because it does have a ridge along the shell that's very distinctive, and I'm sorry that photo's a little dark. Their papillae are somewhat different. They're branched a little more. This species is actually more of a host fish generalist, so it's able to use multiple fish to actually metamorphose their larvae. And then the floater mussels also have a very different type of papillae. They, again, only live 10 to 20 years, and they are very generalist on species. They've been known to reproduce using even non-native fish. So they have been very successful in western habitats. And then here's just a quick slide to show you the difference between zebra mussel and a native mussel. Those are zebra mussels attached to a native mussel on the top there. It's interesting because our native mussels in the eastern U.S. declined after the introduction of zebra mussels. One of the strategies that native mussels have used to kind of fight back against zebra mussels is to actually burrow when zebra mussels attach to them and smother them. So there is hope for native mussels in the eastern U.S. This is definitely a reason why it's important when you see all those signs for stopping your boat and getting an invasive species permit, because if zebra mussels do become widespread in the western U.S., we could see declines in our native species. And they're very prolific. Again, they don't need fish to help them reproduce, so they have kind of an advantage in that strategy. They can just, their populations can explode rapidly. I think a single female zebra mussel can reproduce in her second year, and she can release more than 1 million eggs in her year of reproduction. So they can increase in number dramatically. And you can see there that they're able to just float and then attach onto whatever surface and then affix themselves and filter. A native mussel would have to land in good habitat, essentially, where they're able to burrow. So our native mussels are more limited in their distribution because of that. Okay, so I mentioned that native mussels, they have this unique life cycle. If you look in that top right corner, you can see the image of the Glochidia actually attached to the host fish. So when they attach, they'll attach to the fins, to the head, or to the gills of the host fish. There are differences in the shape and size, so you can actually tell which western species are attached to this fish just by looking. The one on the top right is triangular, and that's actually a floater mussel. This fish is actually also playing host now to a western ridge mussel, which is the smaller circle below that. So just to introduce this next video, our native species do not do this, which is unfortunate because this is pretty incredible, but our native species do have their own strategies for making sure that their offspring will encounter a fish when they need to. Eastern mussel species have developed, a group of them have developed these incredible mantle lures to help them attract fish so that they're able to infect them. So here's just a neat example of one. So what you see there is actually an extension of the mantle, which has the papillae I mentioned. That mantle extension is actually developed into what looks like the prey that this bass would actually feed on. It looks like a fish, and when that bass takes a bite at what it thinks is food, it actually hits the gills of the female mussel, which burst open and release her Glochidia. The Glochidia will insist and then will eventually drop off and develop into the juvenile mussel. But that ability to attract your host is really pretty neat. And they've developed, again, on that bottom right, these incredible looking lures like fish. The top left one actually is made to look like a crayfish. And the mussels will also move around to make it look more like a crayfish. So they actually are kind of on top of the sediment. Remember, they can't see the fish or the crayfish that they're mimicking. They've evolved these really distinct looking creatures, never having seen a crayfish before, which is pretty incredible. You can actually see the gills in there in between the flaps of the mantle. And I should mention that a lot of these images are courtesy of Chris Barnhart from Missouri State University. He's a researcher who has filmed many, many hours of mussel lures, which you can see on YouTube if you so choose. All right, here's another example. This is, rather than having a large lure that this mussel waves around, it actually has a large mantle pad that attracts this fish. It will actually capture the fish, hold on to it, and it even has special anatomy around the mantle where you'll see in just a minute it will expand so that the mantle is actually cushioning this fish while it's being inoculated with the glochidia. Once it has released enough glochidia on this fish, it's going to release it. So a little longer. And then when it's done, the fish swims away. So that's a pretty good strategy for making sure that this interaction between fish and mussels happens. And again, in most instances where mussels are infecting fish with their larvae, it's usually on the order of about 10 glochidia that are microscopic that attach to the fish. In this case, this fish probably got a little bit bigger of a inoculation. Okay, this is another video from Chris that's of juvenile mussels. So this would be after that mussel has developed from the host fish, has dropped off, and you can see it has a rudimentary foot. And they're actually quite active. So at this point, the mussel would be feeding by using its foot. It's called pedal feeding. So it hasn't quite developed to the point that it would burrow down and begin a filtering life cycle, which is how most mussels will feed. In this case, they are actually scooping food into their shell and then directing it to their mouth inside. So this is our western ridge mussel. What's that?
All freshwater?
Freshwater mussels?
Those are all freshwater?
Mm-hmm, yeah. Okay, so here is a nice video that illustrates how freshwater mussels are feeding and breathing. So they require the ability to filter as an adult. You can see this is the in-current aperture, or the siphon, that the mussel uses to breathe. Someone's just put a dye trace, and you'll see that the mussel is actually drawing that in, and now you're starting to see the dye being released outside of the X-current aperture. So this mussel is constantly drawing in that dye. And this is important because they, to filter, to breathe, to reproduce, they rely on their gills. It's a really cool adaptation. And you can see the papillae there. And those papillae, they do look different among different species, and they're also really helpful for excluding things that the mussel doesn't want to eat. For example, they can kind of close and form a little bit of a barrier to keep large objects from coming in. This is an example of sort of the side benefit of how mussels work. This is an image that shows on the left western pearl shell that have been placed in a tank of river water. On the right-hand side is just river water, and you can see that after 3 hours, water becomes clearer where mussels are found. This is important because they're actually cleaning particulates from the water. They are removing pollutants that would otherwise flow downstream. Mussels are able to take up things like E. coli, DDT, flame retardants, pharmaceuticals, you name it. They are probably able to filter it from our water. Sometimes to their detriment, unfortunately, but they do have this incredible effect on ecosystems, and in fact people have been returning mussels to rivers that have lost them because of this benefit that we've lost. You can get clearer water where you put freshwater mussels. Can anybody see the freshwater mussel in this picture? So it's right there tucked in the middle next to the little crayfish claws you might see too. So mussels can be really challenging to see. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you have never encountered one, even if you spend a lot of time in rivers. This is the typical of the lifestyle of a freshwater mussel. They're there, they're filtering, nearly constantly. They're providing us services like clean water, and they look like a rock. Sometimes they look a little bit more dramatic. This is an example of a mussel bed, which is where we have many animals all in one place. You could imagine that filtering ability. When you have many more mussels, you have much more water filtered. And a nice example is a researcher in Oklahoma was measuring the filtering ability of a mussel bed, and what they found was that low flow in the summer, water was actually being filtered through multiple animals as it flowed over a mussel bed. So you think water goes through a sewage treatment plant, and then it goes through a mussel, and then another mussel, and another mussel, and by the time it comes out the end, you've got really nice, good water. This is a bed of western pearl shell. This species can actually occur in really huge density, more than 400 animals in a square meter, for example. So even in as big as one of these tables is, you could have many hundreds of mussels all in one place, and in fact one stacked right on top of the other. And a nice example of the diversity of habitats that mussels can occur in can be, muddy areas, clay, sand, gravel, large blocky rocks. Mussels need places to burrow, and they can reach really high density in some of these areas, but one of the things that they really need is stability, because they really just rely on their foot to keep them in place. So mussels need stable rocks or stable sand they can burrow down into to be found, especially in dense numbers like in the last picture. So you might have noticed that big rock wall in the background. That's probably part of the reason why there's a bed of mussels there. The photo in the top center there is actually of a mussel trail, which you could encounter if you look in drying habitat. So mussels can crawl slowly with their pseudofoot, and they can leave this trail behind. But what you can see is that not having eyes is definitely a disadvantage for a mussel. Sometimes you go in circles. There is actually a mussel in there kind of at the bottom left. That is a western pearl shell that was moving from a drying shoreline. Most mussels really are not going to move much in their entire life, though, maybe on the order of a few meters, if at all. And sometimes you can encounter shells that have actually grown around the shape of the root or the rock that they were up against. So you can get some really crazy shaped mussel shells. So they typically really don't move much. Mussels are eaten by otters, raccoons, muskrat. People have reported seeing a turtle carrying a mussel before. So they are fed upon by quite a few animals, and in fact, fed upon in large numbers. So I've come across what are called shell middens of hundreds of shells from where otters have just plucked them out. They're a very reliable food source because they don't move, and they can occur in such high density. So sometimes animals like otters will really exploit that. This is a nice example of what a healthy western pearl shell population would look like. You could imagine when you have grandma on the top left, who's 110 today. It's nice to see the full progression all the way down to Junior, who's probably just 5 years old. This was from a river in Idaho that had some of the most incredible mussel beds I've ever seen. These animals were all pulled from one small sandy spot. And what's interesting is that in these populations, you often find the older, larger animals on top, and then if you keep digging, you find smaller ones, and then smaller ones, until you get down to the little, very small juveniles. So in a healthy mussel bed, if you find a lot on the surface and you keep looking down, you should find lots of different age classes. So I mentioned that mussels do clean our water, which is a huge benefit to us. They are able to filter something like 8 to, I think estimates have said 20 gallons of water in a single day. An adult animal could do that. They do remove contaminants. That's a nice picture there on the right of actually a mussel that was predated by an otter. And you might encounter this if you're out walking banks. It's pretty distinctive. I got lucky because there's actually an otter footprint right next to the shell, which is a dead giveaway. But you also get this characteristic tooth mark, and then also usually a side where it kind of ripped it open. But animals have a kind of wide range of strategies for actually eating mussels, because some of them can be quite hard to open. They do have muscles that help them to keep their shells closed up pretty tight. So if you pull a mussel up out of the water, it will close its shell pretty tightly. I've heard examples of otters that have pulled a mussel and just set it on a log and just waited for it to die and open up. I found a really interesting example of several mussels on their side. These were western ridge mussels, which notoriously have very strong muscles on their shell, so they're able to stay tightly closed. But they're very slow to move their foot back in, so I found several animals in southeastern Oregon that had been pulled from their spot in the water. Probably an otter had taken a bite of the foot before they could pull it in, just set it back and was going to come back later for it whenever it finally opened up. So they're pretty tricky. Mussels also provide things like habitat for other animals like crayfish. This is actually a western ridge mussel shell that I picked up in the Crooked River near Smith Rock. And it's not an anomaly. I picked up 4 shells and I found 4 crayfish inside who were very unhappy. So mussels do provide habitat for other animals. They really have kind of a reef-like effect in our rivers. They increase the diversity and abundance of other species because whatever they don't want to eat, so they're filtering a lot of things from the water. If it's something they actually don't want to eat, they'll package it up in mucus. It's called a pseudofeces because it never actually goes through their digestive tract. And they just kind of spit it right back out. And that turns out to be food for things that like to graze, like snails and stoneflies and other creatures. Fish are often found in high abundance around mussel beds. Of course, fish and mussels like similar habitat, or you wouldn't find a mussel there, right? That's where the offspring are going to drop off. There's even some neat studies out there that show that mussels, which typically feed on algae and bacteria, they can actually reduce disease-causing bacteria. So fish populations might be healthier where mussels occur because they're actually feeding on what makes fish sick. There's another cool study that showed that larval lamprey will actually grow faster around mussel beds, probably because they also increase that food locally. And this is stuff that otherwise, just flows right on downstream. Mussels are kind of capturing that good stuff and keeping it local. So it's not uncommon to find an example like the snails that are crawling all over the mussel shell there. Humans have also used mussels for thousands of years for food, for trade, more recently for pearl culturing and for the button industry. There's a nice example of, that's actually Western pearl shell bits used in the wampum necklace in the top left picture. That's an example from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. They actually published a book on the tribe's history and use and conservation work with freshwater mussels, which I brought an example of for you to have a look at. They're one of our partners on mussel conservation work. On the right side, these are actually shell middens from the coast, so these are not freshwater mussels. This was the best personal photo I had, but we do find shell middens throughout the Columbia River system from where mussels were harvested for food, mostly the western pearl shell, again, because it's a good starvation food. You go back to the same place year after year and you find mussels. Mussels were used heavily in the button industry, particularly in the eastern U.S. from the late 1800s to the mid-1950s or so. There were estimates that in a single year at the height of the industry, more than 500 million mussels were harvested from the rivers and had the buttons punched out of the shell. So if you look at any shirts that you have that have kind of that pearly button on them, that's plastic now that's styled off of the original pearl buttons. So for mussels, it was actually kind of a blessing when plastic was invented, when the zipper was invented, because that really reduced the demand on their shell. I think over the course of the button industry, they estimate that 11 billion animals were harvested. So it had a huge impact on species in the eastern U.S. Pearl culturing was also another use of mussels. Unfortunately, our native freshwater mussels tended to create kind of lumpy, less attractive looking pearls, not really of gem quality. So after harvest for our native pearls sort of ended, a new strategy was developed where mussel shells were harvested, and they were used to actually start the pearl making process in some Japanese marine mussels. So if you were to go out and buy pearls, there's a good likelihood that, say, pearls from a few decades ago would have part of a native freshwater mussel in it, native to the US, and then is covered in a pearly exterior from an Asian mussel. So most of that culturing is done now with species from China. So the pressure on our native mussels has gone down with that too, but we did use these animals for many years. We harvested them for these purposes. And in part because of that, but in part because of how we have impacted habitat in rivers and lakes all across the country, freshwater mussels are among the most imperiled species in North America, combined with freshwater snails, which are also highly imperiled. And globally, they're also among the most imperiled. A study that was published in 2014, so it's actually a little outdated now, found that 10% of our native mussel species in North America are now extinct. Since this time, it's more than 30. If you compare that to some of the other species found in freshwater, of course, 1% of fish was what was estimated at this time have gone extinct. Among mussels, I believe the current estimate is about 72% of our North American species are extinct or imperiled to some degree. So they're on the endangered species list or will soon be. So mussels face a pretty dire future, in part because of this past harvest, high levels of harvest, in part because of poor water quality, particularly things like mining spills or even tanker trucks rolling over on the highway were found to kill off entire mussel beds. Invasive species like the zebra mussel have had a big impact, and then many other issues, including impacts to their host fish. So if salmon go away, so do pearl shell, for example. Salmon and trout go away. So mussels have had kind of a rough time of it. And in the western U.S., although none of our species are listed as endangered or threatened, they have been declining across their range. So it is important for us to consider kind of how to protect the existing populations. So that's what I do for a living. As was mentioned, I work for the Xerces Society, and we do have a freshwater mussel conservation program. And among the things that we do for that, we assist fish biologists and other biologists across the state in finding where they have freshwater mussels, because one of the first ways to protect a species is to know if you have it. So in the top left, that's actually a photo. I was out snorkeling with Forest Service fish biologists on the South Fork Mackenzie, and I hear that you're having a presentation about the South Fork Mackenzie restoration project. So we did look for mussels before that work happened, and we found a couple of western pearl shell. So that was really great to get out there. We do things like we help relocate mussels from sites where they are in danger of impacts from restoration or moving a bridge or removing a culvert. We can actually assist with moving mussels to new locations so that they won't be killed from the project. I also give workshops on identifying mussels and how to do things like relocate them. And then we do produce research and recommendations for how to protect mussels. And then I did want to talk to you a little bit about your role in freshwater mussel conservation, because again, one of the big things is knowing where mussels are. And I manage a database of freshwater mussel occurrence records. So anywhere where people see shells or see live animals, we like to keep track of that because we're still learning where they are. When they look like rocks, it's hard to find all of them. And so this is just an example of the mussel diversity across Oregon and Washington and Idaho. And you don't have to worry about all the different colors here. It's sort of the different combinations of the three kinds we have. What you can see is that in coastal Oregon, we typically have two kinds. We have western pearl shell and we have floater mussels. In the Willamette, we have all three kinds. And then in portions of central and eastern Oregon, it tips a little bit more towards species like the western ridge mussel and the floaters. In the Willamette Basin, we know that mussels are found in 100 or more water bodies. And what's really exciting is that when people start looking, we start finding them in places we didn't know they were. So in 2018, we got out and did quite a few more surveys, and we increased our knowledge of where mussels are in the Willamette Basin by 10%. So it's really incredible to think that most of Oregon's population lives in the Willamette Basin, and there's still something new to learn. I wanted to point out specifically, we know very little about the Coast Fork Willamette. In fact, our only record for a freshwater mussel in the basin is from 1967. So I could issue a challenge to see if anybody wants to update our records for the Coast Fork, because I bet we do have more mussels out here that people just haven't known anyone's even interested in records for. So if you do see a shell, if you see a live animal, I would really love to know, because that would be great to update our records. And that helps us understand how populations are doing. So we know that mussels are declining in the western U.S. because people are looking for them and not finding them. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and right. And I should mention, so it is technically, with a permit, legal to handle mussels in the state of Oregon, but the average person who does not have a permit to handle fish and shellfish in the state, crayfish in the state, shouldn't be picking up mussels. But photographs of shells are sufficient for identifying the species if you get a good photo, and you can't handle those shells. If you get pictures of live mussels in their habitat, that can also sometimes be helpful for identifying. Yeah, that's a great point. So I did want to point that out as well, because so freshwater mussels were used as food historically. I should warn you now that they were considered not to taste great. Unlike marine mussels, they don't have that delicious, nice briny flavor to them. They've been described as being kind of muddy flavored. You could imagine, given where they live, that they might not taste good. And of course, if they are filtering out a lot of the chemicals that are in our rivers, you probably don't want to eat them for that reason as well. However, mussels have recently been harvested from the Willamette illegally. And we found even examples of someone posting their pot of western pearl shell. Maybe they didn't know, but I'm letting you all know, don't eat them. It is a reserved right for the tribes, but many of the tribes are working more on things like restoration and conservation rather than harvesting for subsistence purposes, which is what mussels were used for historically. So we're trying to put them back in rivers or maintain their populations in rivers rather than pull them from rivers. So if you did observe mussels and you wanted to report that, there are a couple ways you could do that. We have information about freshwater mussels on our website. You can also email me by emailing mussels@xerces.org. But there is, does anybody here use iNaturalist? You use it? Okay. iNaturalist is kind of a popular app that people use to report their sightings, and so that's a great place to report if you do see freshwater mussels. And then there's also a website from a group of us who work here in the Pacific Northwest who are interested in freshwater mussels and their biology and conservation. So if you go to pnwmussels.org, you can find out a little bit more about us. And I think that's all I have. So if anyone would like to hold some shells, we'll pass them around. I can answer a question, and then I'll tell you a few defining characteristics so you can ID them in the field. How high of elevation? Mussels can be found at sea level all the way up to more than 8,000 feet. If a fish can get there, there's a chance a mussel could be there if the habitat exists. Yeah. Yes. Mussels can be artificially propagated, and they are being propagated in large portions of the eastern U.S. to help revive essentially places where they no longer exist in natural habitat. To do that, you need the host fish, and you need a mussel that can reproduce. And so there are facilities in places like the Delaware Estuary Group that have actually created new facilities to help propagate and release new mussels into that area to improve water quality, actually. The Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation are also working to propagate our western mussels because they've been extirpated, or nearly so, from the Umatilla River, so they're interested in returning the native species back to their homeland. So yeah, so propagation is done by several groups in the eastern U.S., but it hasn't been a widespread practice in the West. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, how about a trivia question, which we missed? We chose a foot, an eye, and a mouth instead of a foot, a tooth, and a mouth.
Okay, yeah. So the question was about one of the trivia questions, which was a sneaky one, I will admit. Mussels do have a foot, a tooth, and a mouth, but it is not a real foot or a real tooth. So the foot it's a pseudo foot, so it is muscular. Obviously, it doesn't have the bones that we have in our feet, and it extends, into the substrate. The tooth portion is actually referring to a feature on the shell. And so if you were to come across a mussel shell, a nice example of a tooth in a shell is on the western pearl shell, which I'll hand to you. Now, can you feel there's a little bit of a protrusion there? Okay, so mussels have features, some species have on the inside of their shell what are called pseudocardinal teeth and lateral teeth, and these actually help them to basically anchor their shells closed more securely. So western pearl shell can be found in really high velocity rivers because they're able to close much more tightly. Not all of our native mussels do have these fake teeth. Our floater mussels are called anodonta, referring to no teeth, because they don't have these features actually inside the shell. So it is a diagnostic character that could help you identify what shell you find on a riverbank, for example. So I did want to point out just a couple of features. Western ridge mussel is a distinctive shell because it does have a ridge on the outside of the shell. So if you were to come across a mussel shell that does have this distinctive ridge, they also sometimes have that pseudocardinal tooth on the inside if you were to open it up. But they have a pretty distinctive shape. This is a native species that burrows very deeply. Sometimes all you'll see are the papillae sticking out of the sediment because it's buried almost below the surface. It's an animal that will spend almost its entire life in one spot, not moving at all. Among the western pearl shell, we have some neat variation in the inside part of the shell, the color. This is called the nacre. It's also called mother of pearl. In some of our animals, it's a beautiful purple color, but occasionally you'll come across this really pretty salmon, peachy color on the inside. So there's some variation hidden inside the shell. And then we have our floater mussels, which again, they're very confusing because they actually do lack those characteristics on the inside that might help you tell which species you have in the hand. Their shells can be large or small, they can be thick, they can be thin. Really all that they have in common is that they lack a lot of characteristics. But they do have this typical kind of brownish or sometimes they have what are called green rays on the outside of the shell, and that can help you identify what animal you have. But their shells are typically very light. They easily crack, they easily break down in the sun, so they are typically a favorite of those predators because they're very easy to open. And they can reach really high density, and even in urban areas. There's a stream in the Portland area where we moved more than 3,000 mussels from a 60-meter stretch of a creek. So a very small area, very high density. Yeah.
Do the ridges on the shells are like the rings on a tree tell the age of the
So the ridge on the western ridge mussel is not a character that tells you the age, but on the outside of a mussel shell, they do actually have those rings that they will lay down annually. And so like a tree, you could determine the age of a mussel by counting those rings. One of the issues with trying to do that just from looking at a mussel is that often the oldest part of the shell, which we call the beak or the umbo, it actually breaks down very quickly, probably from abrasion against rocks. So a mussel shell is composed of several layers. The outside is a protein layer that breaks down. And when that breaks down, you lose the visible rings. And this is, again, the oldest part of the shell. So we can't count how many years old it is from here. But if you were to cut through the shell with a microscope, you could count those rings. And in fact, you can correlate the width of those rings with things like river discharge, much in the way you can tell growing season from looking at a tree ring. It was pretty cool. Yeah.
If you were a novice and you were looking to see if they were present, what would be, and you've never really seen them before, I know before I started looking, never saw them, and then when I started looking, they were everywhere. What would be the things to look for if you were out there as clues?
So if you wanted to go looking for mussels, there are a couple of things that you could try to clue into to help you find them. That's a great point. I did want to mention that I've brought multiple copies of the field guide to identifying our native western freshwater mussels here. These are free, so please come get a copy if you'd like to go looking or identifying shells that you find. If you do want to find mussels in the field, one of the first things to look for really is just a shell, especially if it's kind of turned over on its side and you're seeing the mother of pearl, because it's going to be bright, it's shiny. We clue into bright, shiny objects. And where you find a mussel shell, once you find that, you start to look upstream typically from that area, because they do wash downstream sometimes from their original site. But mussels will often be found in groups. So you'll be looking for the shells, then you'll be looking for areas that clearly don't scour out during high flow, or a big shifting sandbar would be a bad place to look for a mussel, because if you want to live 60 years, you probably don't want to get moved out of your habitat repeatedly. So looking for places that have like nice riparian vegetation with good root networks. Mussels like to hide in underneath those roots. You're looking for places that have good burrowing habitat, so don't look for, along a concrete lined channel. You're only going to want to look in places that have water year-round, because they require permanent water. So if it's a stream that dries up or a ditch that dries up, you won't find mussels there. Those are some good starting points. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, again, please do take a field guide with you. And then on the opposite side, I've just got some examples. There's a lovely book from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation that highlights their tribal history with mussels. There's a short article in Xerces quarterly publication, Wings, about freshwater mussels and climate change. And then there's also an example of a document that we released to help people doing restoration work keep an eye out for mussels and what to do if they find them. So just a few examples of some of the work that we do for mussels. And of course, feel free to ask any more questions if you would like. All right.